guys, welcome back to Informed Beauty and welcome back to my wedding series. I'm continuing on with videos about weddings and I'll interject some information about my wedding as I speak about tips. So today's video is going to be about how to choose your wedding photographer, as well as suggestions on how to work with your photographer once you do choose the photographer that you would prefer. This was a particularly important feature for me for our wedding because photos are very, very important to me. My husband could care less about photos. He's not the biggest fan of posing or even just like having candid photos taken of him. But for me, it was very, very important to have memories in the form of photos to look back on, like a photo album or prints on our walls from our wedding that were done by a professional photographer. Having a family friend or family member have take photos of us and just relying on that for a wedding just wouldn't cut it for me personally. But when you're budgeting for your wedding, you need to figure out what your priorities are, where you want to put most of your money. And for a lot of brides, that involves also hiring a professional photographer. There might be some of you that are okay with hiring or just with having a family member or a friend do your photos. But if you want to have professional looking photos, your best bet is going to be to hire a professional photographer. So I just compiled some tips for how to choose one and how to work with one once you do choose one. And I actually had our wedding photographer look through those tips and she added a couple of things that she thought of as well. So let's just roll right into it. So the first tip would be decide on your budget for a photographer. And that leads back to deciding on your overall budget for your wedding and then figuring out where your priorities are, where you want to put most of your money from that wedding budget money, and then divvy it up. So figure out how much money are we going to spend on a wedding photographer, and that is totally going to depend on how much importance you put on wedding photography, what your total budget is on, and also the area that you live in. Some parts of the world or some parts of the country, photographers will generally cost more. It just completely depends on your situation. Before you research photographers, it's important to determine the photography style that you enjoy. So for me personally, I really liked the more brighter colored wedding photos as opposed to like dark and broody and mysterious. And different wedding photographers will have different types of styles. So when you look through like knot.com, weddingwire.ca, Facebook, Pinterest, take a note of the types of photography that you generally lean towards, specifically for your wedding. And the style that you lean towards in your wedding might be different than the style of photography that you might prefer in other parts of your life, and that's okay too. But for me, I determined that I liked the more brighter colored, like light and airy looking photos. So then that would be my third tip. Going into my third tip is research different photographers, email them, phone them, compare different packages and prices, see how much they ask for travel expenses. Let's say they're situated in another city, you want them to take photos in a different city from where they live in, how much would they charge you for that? So questions to ask like that would be important, making sure that they fit within your budget. There's really no point in contacting photographers or once they do contact you and let you know how much they cost, if it's just beyond your means and you're not able to relocate or remove money from other parts of your wedding budget, then it's not worth it. It's important to stick to your budget in order to not go into debt for your wedding, or minimize that if you are going into debt. Hopefully you're not. And also just like asking, my photographer had mentioned asking them if they have a shot list, if they have a very stringent or like rigid shot list. That's not always a good thing either. Having that middle ground between having some flexibility, but also having those go-to photos that they generally take during weddings is what I've gathered is good. And then also just asking them if they get involved with the wedding timeline. Are they involved in the part of that or not? Usually a wedding planner will develop the timeline, or you will develop the timeline. Usually the photographer does not build the timeline for you. The next tip would be making sure you and your fiance mesh with the personality of the photographer. So if you are just not jiving, like let's say you had a Skype call, we had a Skype call with our photographer because we lived in a different province from her. But if you just don't feel the energy or you don't feel comfortable with the way that they communicate, or just something about them that's throwing you off, then maybe it's a good idea to take a look at other photographers and see if your personalities mesh better with another photographer, because you're going to be going through an emotional time during your wedding day. It's a very important day. You want to feel comfortable with the person that's taking your photo, your photos of your family, your friends, when you're half naked potentially as well, getting out of your robe and into your dress and so on. So you want to feel comfortable with them. You want to make sure you jive with them. And that's not really something that I thought of until I started looking into photographers and I started listening to other YouTube videos and things like that. The next tip is, when you're ready, make sure you sign a contract. So let's say you've decided on a photographer, make sure that they do have a contract that they have couples sign. Do not agree to someone taking your photos for your wedding without signing a contract, because if someone bails, like if the photographer ends up being shady and bails on you or something, then you have nothing to go off of. You have no contract or anything. And same goes with, that's where you run into tricky situations of a friend or a family member says that they're a photographer or they're willing to do photography for you, and then something happens, you don't have a contract. So generally, I would recommend, and from my understanding, a lot of photographers would recommend hiring somebody that you don't know, but you get to know, you feel comfortable with, and also making sure you have a contract. Very, very important. And make sure you read through it carefully. Next tip would be to communicate to your photographer wedding shots that are important to you. Let's say you really want a shot of you and your bridesmaids on your bed or an Airbnb bed in your robes or something like that. Like for me, that was really important. So what I did is I posted a bunch of photos of different wedding shots that I wanted on Pinterest. And then I shared other photos with my photographer. I shared my Pinterest board with her so she could see the types of shots that were important to me specifically. I wanted to say me and my fiance, but my fiance didn't really have a preference either way, so I kind of took charge of the photography. And of course through emails and such. Next tip would be visiting the venue that you're going to have your wedding at with your photographer ahead of time before the big day. And that gives your photographer a chance to see where she might set up her light stands. I don't even know if that's the technical term for it. But basically, our photographer had some flash that she planned on using during some parts of our wedding. So she wanted to figure out, okay, where should I put this lighting? If she comes in the day of and she's never seen that venue before, it takes away from the time that she could be taking photos with us on that day. So if she's better prepared by knowing how the space is going to be looking like, what the shape of the room is, things like that, then it's all really helpful for your photographer. So we went to see one of our banquet halls with our photographer. Unfortunately, we were not able to go see the second banquet hall because we had 2 days of celebrations. But at the very least, she did see one of our banquet halls, and she also saw my in-laws' house because she was going to be taking photos of the groomsmen getting ready there. So as much as you can, try to have a meeting with your photographer in your venue or venues. Next tip is, if you have a packed timeline in terms of like lots of different things happening at different times during your wedding day, consider doing a first look. And for those of you that don't know, a first look is basically where you surprise your husband or your husband to be with what you look like on the wedding day in private before you actually walk down the aisle. So you and your husband will know what you both look like, and you'll have a chance to kind of chat with each other before the ceremony happens. And initially, I was against the first look. I really wanted that traditional, I'm going to surprise my husband or my husband to be while I walk down the aisle, and it's going to be so emotional. But then we realized, because our timeline was so packed on our wedding day, the second day, that we may have had some issues with getting all the photos that we wanted. So to give us more flexibility with photos, we decided to do a first look which meant that we now could then take photos, my husband and I together, because we had already seen each other. We could take photos and do bridal photos, sorry, not bridal photos, but bridal party photos before the ceremony. And that just gives you more time to get the photos out of the way. Otherwise, you have to do all those photos after the ceremony. So our photographer had encouraged us to do a first look. We were initially resistant, and then we changed our mind, and we're happy we did, because as it was, our timeline ended up being quite crazy and it went off course. It all ended up being fine, but it definitely would have made things even more difficult than they were already, time-wise. So the next tip is share your timeline, your wedding timeline with your photographer. So if you're working on a timeline with you and your fiance, or if a wedding planner is creating a timeline for you, share it with the photographer and make sure that he or she gives you inputs. Like if they feel like there's a better time of day to take certain photos, they might readjust some of your timeline to accommodate for that, because they know when the sun will set and when the lighting is best, whether you're indoors or especially outdoors. So our photographer actually went above and beyond, and she ended up basically creating the timeline with us because we were really struggling with it. But normally the photographer does not do that function. Normally you would be doing it, or another person you hire would be doing it with you. And then, but it's still important to have your photographer at least review it, just to make sure that your photos are going to be top notch. Otherwise, you could set yourself up for failure without realizing it, just because you don't have that photographer brain. Next tip is, if you have a videographer or a wedding planner, try to introduce them to your photographer before the wedding day, just so that things can work a little bit more seamlessly, or at the very least, your photographer could research the videographer and figure out what their shooting style is, or just even email or phone number or something like that. And then they can figure out what would be the best way to work with that videographer, because they might be simultaneously like taking videos while the photographer is taking pictures. So it sets you up for better success. It sets your photographer up for better success, your videographer, and so on and so forth. We did not hire a videographer. I originally really wanted a videographer, but our budget just wouldn't allow for it. And so I was like, okay, it's either videos or photos. So I decided on the photos. In a utopian world where money was not of a big of a concern, then definitely would have been wonderful to have a video, like a professional videographer. That being said, one of my husband's aunts was kind enough to make a video for both of our days, our Mhendi day as well as our wedding day. We've seen the video from our Mhendi day, and it was so much fun to watch. It's such a good keepsake, and we're so excited that she made that for us. But that was just out of her own, she really wanted to do it, and she wanted to do it for us. And then the second day, we're still waiting for that video, and I am so excited to see it. So definitely have people that you hire meet each other. Another tip would be, do an engagement photo shoot with your wedding photographer. It gives you a really good trial run to figure out how she sets you up, how she directs you as a couple in photos, and what her mannerisms are like, and what your photos actually end up looking like. And I don't know if this is possible, but you could potentially maybe ask your photographer if you could do an engagement shoot before signing a contract for the wedding. I don't know if people do that. I guess the downside would be is you'd have to pay for the engagement shoot on its own. Otherwise, if you sign a contract for the wedding, oftentimes the engagement shoot is included in the price. So it gives you kind of like a bundled deal. But I guess if you really want to be super cautious, I guess you could go ahead and ask your photographer if you could just do a photo shoot, like an engagement shoot, without signing a wedding contract and committing yet to them for your wedding. What we did is we just signed a contract, and initially we did not want to do an engagement shoot with our photographer because we already did an engagement shoot in our home province of Alberta, because we live in Alberta, but our wedding was in Ontario. So we were like, well, do we really want to do a second engagement shoot? And our photographer really recommended it because it just really gives you a good trial run. You get more comfortable with your photographer, you know what it's going to be like, or at least you get a small snapshot into what it's going to be like in the wedding day or during the wedding day. And we're really glad we did it. We got a chance to really jive with a photographer, see how she directed us. If you just pay for the engagement shoot and you see red flags in the way the photographer interacts with you, or you don't like the photos, then you by no means have to commit to a wedding day for that photographer specifically. So I guess you just have to ask your photographer what they feel comfortable with or what they normally do for couples that are wanting a quote unquote trial run. But definitely, whether or not you commit to that photographer or not, always a good idea to do an engagement shoot just to see how things go and just to get you more loosened up in front of the camera. If you are having a larger wedding or if your wedding is multiple days, consider hiring somebody with a second shooter. So basically, there's the photographer and then there's a second person who is also shooting, but they're not the main photographer. And that just gives them a chance, that gives your photographer and your shooter and your second shooter a chance to capture more things that are going on at the same time. Because your photographer is one person and they can only be in one place at one time. So if there's a lot of things happening at your event, or there's lots of people, they may not be able to capture everything that's going on or everything that might be interesting to capture. So if you have that second person, it's just you get extra shots that you normally wouldn't have. So when we hired a photographer, she didn't have a second shooter, but then later on in our wedding planning process, she let us know, hey, I have a second shooter now. I think it would be great if we included it here. Oftentimes, a second shooter is going to add to your cost, but it is often, I would say, worth it. For us, we were very happy. We got a bit of a discount because she hired her second shooter later on in the process, and future couples will have most likely a slightly higher amount that they would pay. But for us, it was definitely worth it because there were times where I was standing on one floor and my husband was standing on a balcony, and the second shooter was standing by my husband taking photos of his reaction seeing me, and then my photographer, or sorry, the photographer, she was taking photos of me looking up at my husband and my reaction. So you wouldn't have been able to get those two perspectives otherwise. The photographer would have had to choose one of the two. So we were very happy that we got those additional shots on our wedding day as well, not just the Mhendi. And we did have a relatively large wedding of about 160 people, I want to say. And I'm really excited to share some more professional photos for you here from our wedding photographer. Now, I don't want to share photos of anyone except for me. Not because I just want to show myself off, but because just for privacy reasons, I don't want to put pictures of my groomsmen or bridesmaids or my husband up here. So it'll just be pictures of me. So I'll be somewhat limited as to what I can share. But dispersed in this video somewhere, I will definitely put some photos of our Mhendi day as well as our wedding day. I'm really excited to share that with you. And just a little more information about our photographer. Her name is Supriya Tukral, and her company is called Chasing Moments. And if you Google Chasing Moments Hamilton, that'll be the first hit. It's chasingmoments.ca is her website. She's based out of Hamilton, Ontario, but I think she may have moved to Waterloo. Regardless, she is based out of Ontario. So if you are getting married in Southern Ontario and you like her style, based off of what you've seen here that I shared in the video, or my previous video about my wedding dress, or if you like her photos that she shares on her website, you can definitely get in touch with her if you like her vibe and see if she'd be able to be your wedding photographer if you're planning a wedding. But we were really excited to see your photos. We're still in the process of printing a lot of them. We've given some away as gifts. We still have yet to order a wedding album, but that is in the works in the near-ish future, because I definitely want like a lay flat type of like professional leather bound kind of styled wedding album that will last years and years and years. So that's something that I'm looking into, but I hope that this video was helpful. If you are a wedding photographer, Comment down below if you have any comments or thoughts about the tips that I've shared with you here today, or if you have additional tips that I may have missed in my video. That would be great as well. And if you're a bride or you were a bride, let me know what your experience was with choosing a photographer, doing engagement shoots, your wedding, how that went, and the photos that came out of it. But for now, I'm gonna say goodbye and watch out for, or look out for more videos from me on beauty, potentially fashion. I might do some fashion videos. I might do some skincare videos, and more wedding videos will be coming as well. Thank you so much for listening. Bye, guys.